Welcome to the Natural Areas Association 2022 webinar series. My name is Maura McGinty-Kloss, and I am the Programs and Communications Manager for the Natural Areas Association. And we really appreciate that you're joining us today. As many of you know who frequently participate in our webinars, the purpose of an NAA webinar is not just to convey information, but to engage natural areas professionals in topics of interest that highlight emerging science, methodologies, and best practices. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. We're a national nonprofit that serves land management practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes in order to protect biodiversity. And we believe that protecting natural areas into perpetuity requires quality science to inform practices and access to reliable resources. So NAA provides science-based content in natural areas for those practitioners and researchers who are seeking applied science, practical solutions, knowledge transfer, and other information that they need for the management of natural areas. We serve federal, state, local, private, all sectors. So we're proud to bring you this information today. I just want to tell everybody about the Natural Areas Conference. We're going to be in person in Duluth, Minnesota. We are so excited. September 6 through 9, 2022. This is our 49th convening. And we are grateful to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, who's put in an extensive amount of support to help us prepare this conference. And we're just excited because Duluth occupies the land and waters of the indigenous people that include the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa, and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, who actively conserve and protect natural resources and continue their traditional practices into today. The registration is open. We have over 100 sessions, hands-on half-day workshops, field workshops, and we hope that you'll check us out at www.naturalareas.org and register. Also, a part of the Natural Areas Conference is going to be the State Natural Areas Program in-person roundtable. And that will be one of our concurrent breakout sessions. And this is a great opportunity for state program managers to get together with their colleagues, talk about emerging issues, trends, challenges, and that kind of thing. And this is where each state can present a report about themselves that talks about their highlights, their achievements. I mean, it's time to brag a little about some of the work that you're doing with people who truly understand. So we hope that not only will you attend the Natural Areas Conference, but that you will consider putting together a pre-recorded state report and then participating in person so that you can share great information about your state and learn from others. Then on Tuesday, June 28, we'll be hosting a virtual symposium, Shared Stewardship, Collaborating Effectively to Co-Manage the Chippewa National Forest. This is a very unique relationship between a Native tribe and the U.S. Forest Service, and they have a memorandum of understanding in place on how they co-manage this forest. So it's highly unique, and we hope that you'll consider registering. We also have a webinar coming up, Join the Crowd, Standardized Monitoring Protocols for the Prairie and Savannah. That's July 12th. It's busy right now. And we have an in-person workshop, the Stewardship in Action Field Workshop, Fragmented Prairies and Grasslands. We have only a few spaces left, but it will be an in-person workshop in the southwestern portion of Minnesota. We'll be visiting 7 different prairie stops. We'll be talking about a model that has the opportunity to be replicated throughout the country that has been successful in Minnesota. So consider checking it out. We're also having July 26th, Native Seed Partnerships, Collaborations to Increase Native Seed Availability. This is a 90-minute session from the Institute of Applied Ecology and their National Partnership Program. And we hope there's a lot to be learned there. Again, a model that can be replicated. And August is Evolution of a Long-Term Resource Monitoring, Data Management, and Information Delivery. And then we're doing something we've never done before. It's a native plant series. It'll be 3 days at noon, October 11, October 12, and October 13. And I'll go through these quickly, but it's 3 different topics and 3 different presenters. And so on the 11th, Wes Knapp will be identifying and preventing plant extinction events. Dr. Anne Francis will be on the 12th, collaborating to conserve crop wild relatives. And then on the 13th, Dr. Elizabeth Bach, long-term data and outcomes from the Nashua grasslands and restoration. And now let's get to today's presentation. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Jed Meunier is an ecologist and research scientist with the Division of Forestry, Forest Economics, and Ecology program. His research interests range from individual species attributes to landscape ecology, with a unifying theme of understanding how forces of climate and disturbance drive ecological change, and how we can in turn manage for resilient systems. His dissertation research was on fire ecology in northern Mexico, investigating spatial and temporal aspects of fire in relation to climate, land use over several centuries. Jed received his MS in the Wildlife Ecology Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying the effects of hunting on declining American woodcock populations. Jed considers himself lucky to spend his time asking questions through applied research to assist in the management of Wisconsin's many treasures. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jed.
Great. Thanks, Maura. Well, great to be with you all. It's looked like a really neat list of participants from really all over. So hopefully I can engage with you all. So what I want to try to do is weave together several different research projects that are either ongoing or have recently been completed that sort of intersect the theme of seasonality and fire. That'll incorporate a couple of projects looking specifically at how fire behavior and fire intensity, temperature and residence time impact woody top kill and resprouting ability of woody plants. And then I want to kind of step back and put some of this into a historical context. So this is the 10,000 foot level historical context. Anybody who's in the last, say, 40 years opened a general ecology textbook that maybe has encountered this. It's Robert Whitaker's Ordination of Global Biomes based on climate. And what's really fascinating to me about this, this figure is really this sliver, this long sort of narrow sliver that he calls ecosystems uncertain. And really what this is it's basically we live smack dab in the middle of a biome that really is not controlled by climate, or at least climate alone. It's the envelope, of course, but that we're in this trimodal state where we could be a grassland, a woodland, or a forest based on something other than climate. And Bill Bond has done a really nice job of sort of analyzing this for globally. And he illustrates that, you know, we have a lot, this scenario covers a large portion of the world. And he does kind of an interesting job of not distinguishing between fire as a disturbance and grazers. He just calls it consumers, but he illustrates essentially that, you know, where we would expect woody biomass, frankly, to be without some kind of a disturbance agent that maintains these systems. Another, you know, coming a little bit closer to our region, and also something that I really like to point out, and I think this is important, is that, you know, the loss of grasslands was very pronounced at the time of European settlement of North America, but really that it's not limited to that era. We've lost a lot of grasslands just from habitat degradation in the last, say, 70 years. And so the data that I have up here is from Amy Allstadt's work at the University of Wisconsin. And she went back and resurveyed plots that her graduate advisor had resurveyed, who in turn was working on surveying plots that John Curtis set up in the late 40s and early 50s. So we have, what's cool about this is it's not just the magnitude of change over 2 time points, but because it was done multiple times, we have sort of a rate of change. And what Amy found was that, you know, we've had a 129% increase and invasive species, many of them woody plants, and a more than 200% decline in natives over that time period, and that the rate of change has been accelerating in recent years. Another thing that I think is important is from that 1950 to 1980s time point, really the driver, the factor that determined whether grassland was relatively intact or high quality or not was driven by soil moisture. And I don't think that's surprising to anybody here who deals with grasslands or restoration. The invasive pressures on richer sites are just pronounced. But the cool part is from the later time period, what really stands out is that soil moisture is still a factor, but the influence of patch size grows, as does fire history. So what that means is whether a site had experienced fire at any interval during that time frame was one of the primary factors of whether that was a quality site or highly degraded. So I guess that's another way of saying management matters. So that's a silver lining there. So one more sort of a big picture thing. So when I started probably 7 years ago with working for the state of Wisconsin, one of the first things that I did was work with a group to do what we called the fire needs assessment. And various states have replicated this with their own methodology, but we essentially were trying to identify where we had the greatest opportunity to manage fire dependent communities. And so one thing you'll notice from the list on the right, the table, is that fire dependent communities covered a gamut of different ecosystems. And it also, the methodology was such that it wasn't just based on rarity. It was a cost benefit sort of framework. Things that were made managing communities more challenging, like whether it was in the WUI or how often it needed to be burned, were taken into consideration. And this was ultimately a spatial exercise. And so the map that you see is the map of where we have the greatest opportunities. And of course, we don't need Amy Allstadt's work to tell us, that we're dealing with the dry landscapes. The Northwest is outwash sands. That big central area of red in the middle is the central sands, the glacial lake bed of Wisconsin, and then the Northeast sands. But essentially, the other point that I think is really worth highlighting here is that what we found was that just to maintain our fire dependent communities where we have the best opportunity to maintain them, we'd need to be burning 1 million acres a year. And one thing I did was I took a Marinette County and I squared it off. So that's the box on the map there. And that is approximately the same area as the area we would need to be burning each year. So we're falling far below that in the state of Wisconsin. And so why don't we just burn more? The $1 million question with rather obvious answers, I guess. And so another thing that I did with colleagues here in the state of Wisconsin was we surveyed different managers, anybody who had used fire within a 10-year period, and asked them what were the biggest barriers to burning and what were their primary objectives, and tried to learn something about our burn program. And of course, these shouldn't be all that unique. And in fact, when we look at it more regionally, so this is, I think this is the National Prescribed Fire Report that I pulled up here. And it's the same factors are popping up. And again, these aren't perfect categories. They're not mutually exclusive. So, for example, policy dictates what weather conditions we can burn under. So it influences that. Weather obviously drives capacity. So if you have fewer burn days, that limits capacity even more. So they're not perfect categories, but generally we see these same factors popping up again and again. And in fact, I'll just pause here and one thing I'd be interested in is if you do burn, if you are a manager, a practitioner, or burn your property, I would be curious to learn what your primary burn objectives and maybe even barriers are. So if you feel like popping that up in the chat, that might be something that I would really like to see that. I'm just always curious. But anyways, so we've got these sort of usual suspects that are popping up in this region. And when we look, so this is state of Wisconsin, cumulative acres burned over a 10-year period on the bar graph. And so what's not surprising to anybody in this region, of course, is that we really have the month of April plus or minus a couple of weeks is when the majority of our prescribed burning takes place. And the weather parameters I have put up here are sort of generic prescription that I developed to try to mine some climate data and learn about how these windows of opportunity may be changing over time. And the first thing that I did was I just plotted the acres burned for each year, and then the number of burn days using this generic prescription that I have above. And so that really, I did that for two reasons. One is being a typical sort of academic, I want to prove the obvious maybe, but more importantly, I want to know if these generic prescriptions replicate reality. And we really do get a pretty tight relationship between what we have as opportunity identified by these generic prescriptions and what we're able to burn in a year. So we are, another way of thinking about it is managers are really utilizing the opportunity they have, and that's driving the acres we can burn. And so then I took those generic prescription windows and I looked at them more in depth. And the reason is, when I was interviewing different burn managers in Wisconsin, the things that I kept hearing over and over again were that, the burn window just isn't what it used to be. And, we're dealing with way more variability. Things are different. Things are wacky. And this is a quote from one of many people I talked to. And it's pretty, this was something that we were hearing a lot. And so I wanted to look at that. So I plotted the number of prescription days are by region in that little map in the subset. So it's not at a 1 point or a burn unit per se. But the thing that is of interest to me is, what is the variability and what is how are the burn windows of opportunity changing over time? And so I have a decade of data from the 1980s and then the 2000s. And really what you'll notice is that we do have a lot of opportunity. It hasn't necessarily shrunk, but what the data showed was that, especially in the spring, we're getting way more variability. So this picture of prescribed burn ahead is an actual, burn day that got canceled. And that makes life very difficult. So we may have the absolute number may be growing in terms of days that we have to burn under those prescription windows. But if you have 5 days of good weather followed by 5 days of poor weather, that's a very different scenario than good weather followed by bad weather and good weather and bad weather, et cetera. You get the drift. So we're dealing with more variability, and that has grown. And so, and this is where all of this, I guess, is leading, and is, what I also learned was the primary burn objective. So 86% of burn plans in the state of Wisconsin, so state burns, Wisconsin DNR, list woody species control as their primary objective. And I think if we mined some of those burn plans for other objectives, that number would only grow. So the vast majority of burns are really targeting this problem. And it's not unique to one system, it's across all fire dependent systems in this region. And so, in thinking about how we can, reduce woody species, we really have limited options at hand. And so we can try and manipulate fire frequency. But as I've mentioned in some of the surveys, we have a capacity problem. To burn something every year is a lot more work and will require more resources. We can manipulate intensity, But there again, especially in the Wisconsin DNR, we're risk averse, and we're limited to fairly moderate conditions that we're really allowed to burn under that meet those what we think of as prescription. So we're somewhat limited on how we can manipulate intensity with our fire. And then there's timing, seasonality, and so that's plant physiology or phenology. So, and I should just say this up front, like I'm going to be talking about seasonality a lot. That means really different things in different places and for different species. So I'm going to be using it generically in reference to really the phenological state of plants. But so this is the thing that I want to talk about. And I think this is what we've really underutilized in our region. We just haven't explored phenology and seasonality of burning. And one exception to that, there has not been a lot of research in this region, the upper Midwest or Great Lakes region, but an exception is out of Minnesota. It's Robert Buckman's work in the 60s in the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. And what Buckman did is he set up these replicated blocks, and he was really interested in hazel, both species of hazel, beaked hazel and American hazel. And so what he did was he compared season of burning, spring dormant and growing season, summer burns. And what he found was that, one in a spring burn, and he did burns once, twice, 3 times, and I think maybe even up to four different burns. But the effect was essentially in a spring burn, you knocked back hazel, you had good top kill, and you had the resprouts came back with a vengeance, and you had the same amount or more hazel than you did prior to the burn the same year. And that trend continued, that it really didn't change even with replicated multiple burns. But with the summer burn, you knocked back the hazel and it was slower to come back. And with replicated summer burns, it literally eliminated hazel from many of the plots, and it reduced it by at least 80% in all of the plots. And I think if you go back to these sites to this day, which is 70 years later, you can still see the differences between where Buckman's summer repeated burn plots were and elsewhere. So this was really a pretty foundational piece of work and influenced my thinking, at least. And so I wanted to sort of expand that to various systems. So I helped set up a research project in southern Wisconsin, so really covering a variety of grasslands, but all basically in the southern third of the state. And so we instrumented prescribed burns. And what you see here is a picture of one of those a plot. And then we set up grid points within a burn in several locations. And we wanted to try to capture different fire behavior, maybe a backing fire and a head fire if we were able to, by splitting a grid point. And we went out ahead of the burns, and we clipped live and dead fuels. So we quantified fuel loads. We placed a stake in to measure char height on the burn itself. We buried a thermocouple data logger that records temperature, and it also gives us an idea of residence time in a burn. And then we also measured the number of woody stems in a 2-meter radius circle at each of these permanent plots. So we measured the fire behavior itself, flame length, and some of those qualitative metrics. And then we came back after the burn and measured duff consumption, picked up our loggers, downloaded the data. And then 2 months later in the growing season, we measured resprouts of those burns. And some of this data, we actually did that for a couple of years, the resprouting. And I'm still analyzing some of this data, so it's not entirely complete. But we're learning a bunch. And so the sort of the basic questions are, things like, does flame length matter? And this sounds like another one of these academics proving the obvious, and it really is. But we know, for example, that soil heating can be very different. Flame length may not be a good driver of what you're getting on the soil surface. And so remember, these probes are about 6 inches off the ground. So, what's happening 6 feet off the ground may not be indicative of 6 inches, but as the data shows us that this data, by the way, is for spring burns. So it's really specific to the picture on top. And so we get a pretty tight relationship between head fire, flame length, and maximum temperature. So that was interesting. We also tried to analyze our data with different fuel models and also within what drives prescription. So here's an example where we took for spring burns, we took the average relative humidity, the average wind speeds during our burn. We plugged all these factors in, and we also observed the actual flame length. And then we said, well, what does our prediction tell us? And so what we found very consistently for some of our most common grass fuel models is that the models are over predicting flame length by 50%. So this is, again, an average over mini burns. And what we're told will happen is we'll get 12-foot flame lengths. And in reality, we got 6 or 7-foot flame lengths. And so this could be an issue because, again, especially if you're burning for, the state of Wisconsin, a lot of what we do is based on flame length. So that was an interesting finding. And the other part of this, as we get into the growing season part of burns, so, the original fuel models that were the Anderson 13, and those are sort of static in that they don't incorporate live and dead fuels. And in an attempt to sort of expand fuel models for prescribed burn applications where you could have more live fuels and not just all cured fuels, a new batch of fuel models called the Scottenbergen fuel models are supposed to help us capture that. And so the grass fuel model 6 is a very common basic fuel model that incorporates live and dead fuels for grassland systems like we have here in the Midwest. And so what those models tell us is that after about 120% live fuel moisture, it's unburnable. And the reason that can be over 100% is because plants can hold up to 3 times their weight and moisture. So really those metrics go from about 30% to 300. So you can, we are above 100% here. And what we find is that, these models don't really help us much with growing season burns. And so we consistently had mean live fuel moisture over 120%, and we had really, really good fire effects. And another just sort of side note here, if growing season burns are somewhat new to you, they are, I think, to many managers that I work with. And we routinely ran into managers saying, well, you can try to burn it, but good luck. It's green and it's probably not going to do anything. And the fire behavior is not very spectacular, might be smoky, but oftentimes we got really, really thorough burns and really great fire effects. So getting into the data. So this is for the field experiment that I've been sharing with you. And so what we did was we looked at top kill and then resprouts. And so on the left here we have top kill, and we got really good top kill with spring burns especially. And so there seemed to be a threshold. So if we look at that, the hotter temperatures on our burns were significantly different from the others. And I think these are broken up into quartiles of our data. And so we cross some threshold and you get excellent top kill. The other part of that story is the resprouting stems. And so remember, this is at an individual 2-meter radius point, which was set up in a grid in multiple places for 60 different burns, roughly split between spring, summer, and fall. And what we see is that, some of our hottest spring burns, for example, we got 150% increase in the number of woody stems. And those species are now pooled. So we're talking about gray dogwood, we're talking about willow, we're talking about honeysuckle, lots of things. So it's you have to kind of take this as right at the moment as generalities. And so the really fascinating thing was our summer burns were significantly different from the other seasons, where we had less than one resprout in our plots. So that was really striking data. And fall sort of was somewhere in between. And so the first question is, well, is it fire intensity? Like, can we tie that to temperature or to residence time? And so this is just the resprout data. And essentially there's no statistical difference between our the quartiles of low, mild, medium, hot. We just can't explain resprouts based on residence time or on temperatures. And so really it's driving at that phenology component. So one thing we recognize, and we have to be cognizant of, is there's a lot of variability in a prescribed fire. And so this is an example of that. This is 36 data loggers and the same fuel, same fire, and really we have a huge spread of the data. So there's all these confounding factors that we have to consider when we start to tease this apart. And so recognizing that, we set up a companion study that we could control more closely temperature and residence time and season, and we broke the seasons into 4 different seasons. And so we manipulated, we took a propane torch and put a regulator on that torch and also messed with it to manipulate the mixing of the rear port entry. So the way it mixes and how hot that flame is coming out of the business end of the torch. So it took some experimenting to figure out how we can really dial in temperature, and we did that. So we were able to manipulate both residence time and temperature more exactly. And we used our actual field burns to set our targets for temperature and residence time. So these are the sort of the middle range of our data and upper range. So we changed the pressure, and we did this for 3 different species of plants: common buckthorn, honeysuckles, and also for pin oak. And the pin oak was up in the Cedar Wildlife Refuge in the Central Sands, where it's a native species, but somewhat aggressive and usually a target of control and prescribed burns. And then the buckthorn treatments were done at the UW Arboretum, South Central Wisconsin, and honeysuckle at UW Platteville in the Southwest. So there's a picture of the vapor torch that we modified so that we could figure out control temperature. And I should say that the duration, the low or the short and long duration is really based on what we were hoping to get to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what was it, 15 and 30 seconds were what we calculated as the time above 140 degrees. So which is considered the lethal temperature to plants, to cells. And so this is the actual data from our temperature. And so it's a density diagram. And really what this is telling us is that, our treatments worked pretty well. The low and long treatment is a little bit more spread out than we'd like, but I think relative to the others, I think this data looks pretty good and controls for some of that variability we had with those with the field setting. And so these are the data so what you have are the 3 different species, and then top kill in the column on the left and resprouts counted on the column on the right. And then at the bottom on the x-axis, you have spring, early growing, late growing, and fall. And the colors correspond to, high temperature, long duration, all the way to low temperature, short duration. And so there's some difference by species here, but by and large, especially for pin oak and honeysuckles, we got really good top kill, higher top kill with with the early growing season and late growing season, buckthorn is more evenly spread, at least for most of the treatments. But resprouts are where things again get really interesting. And I think I'm going to show the same data, but with a graph that might be a little easier to interpret. And so this is set up pretty much the same way. When you get a bright yellow color, that means really good top kill. When it's darker green, it means little or no top kill. And the size of the circle is the number of resprouts. So essentially, buckthorn, it didn't matter. You got really good top kill really across the board with hot temperature, long duration, or even low temperature, long duration. But you also got really good resprouting response regardless of season, spring, early growing, late growing, fall. And so that was somewhat different for the other two species. We got a much better top kill and lower resprouts, especially in that late growing season, so August. So we really feel pretty confident about these results and think that there's something to it. So I want to just switch gears a little bit and put this into historical perspective. And so the map that I'm showing you here is the Sargent map. And really what it shows is it was focused more on woodlands and forests really than grasslands, but it's a snapshot of fires in 1880, a burned area or proportion of burned area. And so what really stands out is the Eastern United States had a lot of fire. It was a fire landscape, and you guys all know that. And so the part that I'm interested in is, a lot of those fires, the really big, really destructive fires, like in 1871 in Wisconsin, it was the Peshtigo fire that burned 1.2 million acres. And in Michigan, it burned twice as many acres. And that fire, as most of you probably know, is the most destructive fire in human history in this country. 1881, a big fire year in Wisconsin and Michigan. It's called the Michigan Thumb Fire, over 1 million acres there. 1894 is best known in Hinckley, Minnesota, where it was the most destructive fire in its history. In Wisconsin in July, it burned through the town of Phillips and killed a couple hundred people there, et cetera, et cetera. So these are really destructive, really large fires, and they are named usually after where they did the most damage, but they're usually regionally significant fires, so they burn through multiple states. Fire years is a better way of saying that than individual fires. But the cool thing is, if you look at them and you sort of dissect these fires, they were primarily in the summer or mostly in the fall months. So seasonality of wildfires, we think of spring as our wildfire season and our prescribed burn season, but that wasn't always the case, certainly for wildfires. The problem is there was a lot going on here, and I think we're very quick to dismiss the interesting nuances of this era as just an anomaly of European settlement. And if you think of John Curtis, who I mentioned, who set up he really developed the method, the ordination method, that it's called that is Wisconsin ecology, really, and it was this person, John Curtis, who was one of the early community ecologists that Whitaker followed in his footsteps, and so many others. And Curtis, he probably had a better handle on disturbance and communities and than anyone at his time, but he still struggled with disturbance. And you can see it in his writings in Vegetation of Wisconsin. He talks about reversion rather than progressive succession. And I think, he was of his time in some ways, and very much in this sort of, whether it was the Clemensian thought or Gleason or Tansley, but he was still thinking of communities in terms of succession. And disturbance, like fire, puts a wrinkle in that. And if you think about what Curtis was operating on, and so many others at that time, and we still are in many cases, is this European settlement era, which was an anomaly. And Curtis was 50 years removed maybe from an intact quote unquote fire regime, and even more so today. So this is I happen to have a fire history site that is one of Curtis's plots in the Wisconsin Dells in south central Wisconsin. And so, I have I've put, this is a chronology. It's a composite of the different fire years that occurred on multiple samples. And basically, if we put those settlement era fires into a longer, say 400 or 300 year context, there's really, it's hard to imagine them being all that anomalous. And really, this is how I went about that. So I'm a dendrochronologist. I study time through trees and specifically fires I'm interested in. And so, many of these trees, like I'm taking a partial section of here, are now were cut over about 150 years ago and look like those stumps that you're seeing in the rest of the pictures. So we're able to collect those. And red pine in particular have thick bark, self-prune their lower branches, so they have high canopy base height. They're meant to survive fire, and they do. And even when they get a basal injury like you're seeing there, they tend to live for hundreds of years. And the tree then is a recorder. It tries to grow over that injury and gets re-injured and re-injured. So we're able to reconstruct fire history with those samples for hundreds of years. And this is a little bit of a digression, but going back to that theme of, reference points and Curtis having been 40 years removed from fire regime and European settlement fires. So I got interested in this and recently published a paper looking at, that settlement period in particular. And so this is just an example of, these are box plots of, of the fire return interval. And I'm comparing settlement, I think was 1850 and beyond, maybe. I'm not sure I have that right. I think that's right. And then pre-settlement in this case is anything before that. And so I compared fire return intervals. And really, by and large, the only significant differences are significantly longer fire return intervals in the Euro settlement period. The only ecological landscape with shorter fire return intervals in that settlement period was the Northeast Sands of Wisconsin, which I don't know if you see my cursor, but that's up here. And interestingly, those sites that we used to develop fire history from were primarily never logged old growth stands. So this whole idea of slash-driven fires and anomalously frequent fires and large during the settlement period is suspect. And so but I think how it ties into what we're talking about here is this idea of seasonality. So we're not only able to tell you what year a fire occurred in, but within an annual ring, you sometimes or often can determine the seasonality of a fire based on the position of the fire scar within the annual ring. And so the picture I have here, I don't know how well it projects, but I have an example of a growing season fire and a dormant season fire. A dormant season meaning the origin of that fire scar is between two annual rings. And so this is preliminary data, but it should be very obvious, for the sites that I have here, that seasonality was very, very mixed in the state of Wisconsin. And it's interesting, even, some of the southern relics. So we've gone into these little red pine relics that are on little sandstone rock outcrops in the driftless area and Baraboo Hills. And, 46% of fire scars that we're able to attribute seasonality to were growing season fires. So this data is a little more polished. And in fact, these are from a paper that's getting ready to be submitted with a graduate student. Colleen Soothmeyer did the work and with me. And so this is across the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it's actually also borrowing from co-authors data from Seney Wildlife Refuge and the Huron Mountains of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So what the photos below and that are labeled, I think, A through F, what they show you is just the diversity of landscapes. So we're way up, in the Huron Mountains, all the way down to large, peatland complexes like Seney, to these pine pockets on the sand plains, to landscapes like the Hiawatha National Forest, which is a big sand plain. So anyways, it's a real diverse mix of landscapes and communities. And so what we're seeing even across these is really, I think it's the rule, not the exception now, from what the data is showing me, that seasonality of fire was always mixed across this region. And so this concept of narrowing everything down to the month of April plus or minus 2 weeks, I think is really fundamentally flawed. And so this is maybe kicking a dead horse a little bit, but I am really interested in this. So at one time I compiled precipitation and lightning data. So a question I often get is about lightning and maybe even Native American ignition sources, and what was the ignition. And so we don't really know, but in thinking about that though, I compiled some data. So what you're looking at are a county up in north central Wisconsin, Oneida County, and a county in south central Wisconsin where I'm sitting, Dane County, where Madison, our capital, is. And so one thing that stands out, so the lightning is 30 years of lightning data, and this is cloud to ground lightning, so strikes. And the bars show that, and we have a lot more lightning in southern Wisconsin than we do in northern Wisconsin. So that's something of interest. And the other thing, one of the main arguments that we didn't have much lightning fire was that, lightning comes with rain, it comes when everything's humid and wet and green, and those are all true. But I think if we then look at the other part of the data that I've incorporated, which is 100 years of precipitation data. So the bars are, and I think I can get this straight, are the average of precipitation free interval by month for a year, and it's 100 years of data. So essentially it's looking at like how steep it is. So something up here is has and this is rain, not snow. So there's a lot of precipitation free days, whereas in the month of June there are very few. And it drops off pretty steeply in both counties, and then it's a long gradual drying trend. So I think it's a way to just illustrate that we really do have plenty of opportunity on even just the shoulders of the quote unquote lightning season for ignition. And a quick anecdotal story. So last summer, coming out of the wettest 5 years in history in the lake states, where the Great Lakes were up feet from historical averages, we had a relatively normal or slightly dry year last year. And I had planned a family vacation after Canada opened its borders with the coming out of the worst of COVID, and to the Quetico wilderness area for a canoe trip with my family. And I couldn't make it because fires basically closed down the Quetico even after it reopened post-pandemic, or however we describe the pandemic. So fires were ignited in the middle of the summer, and they pretty much burned all summer long and spoiled my trip there. So I rerouted to the Boundary Waters, where a lightning ignited fire ignited on the west end, east end of the Boundary Waters, where we'd planned our trip, and closed the park the day before that trip. So lightning, even under moderate conditions, can occur. And also, these, like in the Quetico, it burned for months, some of those lightning fires, and all it would have taken was deteriorating conditions and some wind, and you would have had a very different summer up there. So I want to just end with a picture and a quote from Leopold. So this picture is a picture of Aldo Leopold and his students at the UW Arboretum around 1940 doing a prescribed burn. So that was a pretty revolutionary act at the time. And our tools have certainly grown, but we have some growing to do as well. And so the quote is, "Experiment, not doctrine or philosophy, is the key. Timidity, optimism, or unbending insistence on old grooves of thought and action will surely either destroy their remaining resources or force the adoption of policies which will limit their use to a few." And so I think that quote speaks to me in a couple of different ways, but we really need to rethink seasonality of fire. And we're being forced to do that in terms of wetter springs, more variable climate, and a need. We have a real need to be amping up our acres burned and doing more management, not less. And so anyways, that's a kind of a fun quote. And with that, I'll end with a couple of acknowledgements of folks that have helped me along the way and are co-authors on some of the papers that have come out of this. But yeah, so if I don't know how I'm done for time, but I'd love to interact if that's possible.
Thank you, Jed. Yeah, we do have a little time for questions. A couple have come in and some came in and you answered them along the way. So that was good. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in chat, and we have 5 to 10 minutes to have some additional discussion. So one question was just the extinguish memo. Can you just comment, what is the extinguish memo?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, that is confusing. So that's pretty specific to Wisconsin and to the Wisconsin DNR. So the timing was conspicuous of my survey in that we had a burn memo that comes out. It actually comes out every year that sort of sets the stage for what we're going to do fire-wise. And that burn memo was revisiting this failure to extinguish. So in essence, we reinterpreted something that had been on the books, and the way we reinterpreted it was that we had to sit on a fire until there was no visible smoke. And so it could, you could be surrounded by 20 miles of cornfield where there's no chance of anything catching fire, and your unit is pretty well gone. But if there's a smoke in the middle of it, we're sitting there until it's out. So it put a real onus, a burden on mop-up procedures. And that, of course, is part of that policy. Yep. So things like that come along. And I think it was fresh on people's minds. So there was a lot of comment on that.
Okay. There was one question regarding temperature and flame length. Can you comment a little more on that?
Yeah. Well, so the data that I was showing was just for spring burns, and I think the question is, we're really tied to flame length for so many things, whether we're in prescription, with go no go, based on how that interacts with our fuel models. And what we found was that you really do get good fire intensity, you get good flame lengths and good temperatures in the spring burns. So, and I'm digressing a little from maybe the question here, but I think I want to state this, and that is summer burning is really important, and we need to start thinking about it. That does not negate spring burning. We need those spring burns. We need all the burns we can get. We need to mix the seasonality. So we really get, in many cases, better top kill with those spring burns because we get those flashy fuels and higher flame lengths. So the data that I showed you was really just for spring burns, and it illustrated that it's a pretty tight relationship between flame length and temperature, as measured 6 inches above the ground by our thermocouples, our probes.
Okay. How does varying seasonality of burns affect herbaceous vegetation, especially non-native cool season grasses in restored prairies? Well,
great question. And I'm sure there are people on here that could answer this question and others better than I can. But I think, cool season grasses are a problem. I have a colleague who has done a lot of work trying to control cool season grasses with fire, and he usually burns late spring. So that would maybe be what I would call the early growing season, to knock back the cool season grasses. So when they're putting energy into getting ready to seed and hurting them that way. So I think that's a special case, and there are lots of those actually. So I've spoken in real generalities here in many cases, but I think stepping back to herbaceous plants and natives and the things we're trying to help overall, there's pretty good evidence from other places that the more you mix up seasonality, the better response you get from other herbaceous plants. So cool season grasses may be a unique case, and recognizing there's, if we go through species lists, there's going to be winners and losers with every burn probably at different times.
So those are all the questions that were in chat. I have to say, I think a lot of the questions, your presentation was so well done that a lot of the questions got answered as you went through. So congratulations, thank you for that. Those of you who have been joining us, I just want to let you know that I have been posting the articles and the research that Jed had mentioned during his presentation. So that will be available on the archive. Also, at the end, once we edit this video, you will be receiving access to the recording. So Jed, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wonderful, data-rich presentation, and we really appreciate your presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you.
All right, everybody, we'll see you next time.